Hi, thank you for coming to see my presentation. I'm Chaeyong Park, a PhD student at Post-Tech, South Korea. The title of paper is Visuo-haptic Crossmodal Shape Perception Model for Shape-Changing Handheld Controller Weighted by the Inertial Tensor. Our research was conducted by my co-author Jeongwoo and my advisor Seungmoon Choi. In virtual reality, handheld controllers are basically input devices and provided the various haptic sensation to improve the immersive experience. But typical handheld controllers have fixed shape and size, so they cannot represent the perceptually similar shape of various virtual objects. Thus, the user experiences of visual and haptic data are not consistent. To this end, to provide the visual haptic-congruent sensory experience, researchers proposed the shape-changing controllers as a solution. But we do not have any general computation models that explain the human perception of shape-changing handheld controllers. So, in this paper, we built a Visuo-haptic Crossmodal shape perception model for shape-changing handheld controllers to provide congruent visual and haptic multisensory experiences to users in virtual reality. Before introducing my work, I briefly explain dynamic touch, which is a pivotal concept for our research. Dynamic touch is a kind of touch mode. Humans perceive the object shape information such as length, width, heaviness, volume, and orientation through the minimal body movement, like holding and wielding. In dynamic touch, the moment of mass distribution significantly affects on perceiving the shape information. The moments of mass distribution include mass, static moment, and inertial tensor. The static moment is related to the object center of mass, and the inertial tensor is related to the rotational inertia of each rotational axis. Inertial tensor has 3 diagonal terms called the moments of inertia and 6 off-diagonal terms called the product of inertia. But because it is hard to consider a physical variable to build a perceptual model, we conducted a computer simulation to find the important variables for shape perception. We assumed a handheld object with mass distributions projected onto the half plane by varying the lengths and angle between 2 cylindrical parts. Then, we compare the elements of the moments of mass distributions with correlation coefficients and PCA. As a result, we choose the primary moments of inertia called MOI and the product of inertia called POI as the important variables. These are examples of MOI and POI of different shape of the cylindrical rods by varying the 1D length and 2-dimensional area or asymmetry, and both of them. Then, we conducted 2 user experiments to confirm the perceptual importance of 2 variables. We investigate the human discrimination performance of length and asymmetry of handheld objects. Participants wielded the physical objects and evaluated its perceived length in experiment 1 and asymmetry in experiment 2. The experiment followed the method of constant stimuli that can derive the psychometric function of the perception. Furthermore, we can derive some thresholds and the corresponding Weber fractions. The results of experiment 1 showed that the MOI of physical object has a dominant effect on the perception of the object length. We investigated the perceived length of objects from short to long, and the Weber fraction of length perception was very low, about 7%, which means that the people can discriminate a 7% difference in MOI regardless of the object's actual length. In experiment 2, POI had prominent effects on asymmetry perception with significant interaction with MOI. There are entire psychometric functions and the sensitivity of POI decreases as MOI increases. Then, we built the Visuo-haptic Crossmodal shape perception model by conducting the third user experiment. The input variables are the properties of physical handheld objects, and output variables are properties of virtual objects in VR. It means that this model suggests the best visual shape of the virtual object that matches the perceived attribute of the physical object in the real world. The experiments contain the various shapes of objects with different MOI and POI. Participants interacted with the physical objects and then made the virtual objects until they perceived visual and haptic stimuli as similar. Then we obtained a regression model that explains the haptic-to-visual shape perception. This figure visualizes the regression model for crossmodal shape perception. There are large differences in aspects depending on the range of MOI. In addition, in the case of physical objects at POI is 0, their virtual matches show the increasing POI as MOI increases. This behavior indicates a strong interaction between MOI and POI, especially large MOI. Furthermore, in actual application, we can easily compute the physical configuration of a shape changing controller that matches the visual shape of the virtual object using the model's inverse form. Finally, we conducted a summative user study to assess the validity of our perception model. The experiment consisted of two phases. The first is Visuo-haptic Crossmodal matching, and the second is assessing user experiences. For these experiments, we chose 5 different shapes of virtual objects and implemented the corresponding physical objects based on the perceptual model. In phase 1, participants interacted with one physical object and matched the shape of the virtual object among 5 virtual objects. Participants identified the haptic object from a visual object with about 87% accuracy. In phase 2, participants interacted with 5 virtual scenes. Then, they evaluated user experiences under 3 haptic conditions: the best matching object predicted by our shape perception model, a mismatched object, and the original controller of the head-mounted display. Our visual to haptic matching method improved the user experience for all cases. The result said that to increase the user experiences, a visual and haptic matching environment is essential. The contribution of this work are finding effective physical variables for shape perception, including MOI and POI, building regression functions for visual to haptic crossmodal shape perception in VR, and evaluating the user experiences of the perception model. This is end of my talk. Thanks for listening.